My name is Laura, and at 38 years old, the air in the state-run shelter smelled of lemon bleach and forgotten promises. I was only 6 years old, clutching a threadbare teddy bear, watching my mother meticulously adjust her silk scarf while my father checked his watch, annoyed by the slow paperwork. There were no tears, no lingering hugs, only the chilling scratch of a fountain pen as they signed away my existence. They didn't just leave me, they deleted me. As their taillights faded into the rain, they were certain I was a secret buried forever, a mistake erased for the sake of their high society ambitions. But they forgot one thing. Every action leaves a trail, and some secrets have a way of growing teeth. Fast forward through the silence of 30 years. My parents are in their sprawling estate, sipping expensive wine, convinced they won the game of life. Then, the gravel crunches. A sleek, black sedan, the same one that haunted my childhood dreams, idles in their driveway. Its headlights burn through their living room window like twin suns of judgment. When the door opens and a man in a tailored suit steps out with a heavy leather file, the color drains from their faces. They think they're seeing a ghost, but they're actually seeing the architect of their ruin. Stay with me until the very end, because what started in that cold shelter wasn't a tragedy, it was a trap. Today, you'll discover how a discarded child became the landlord of her parents' nightmare. This isn't just a story of survival. It is the ultimate blueprint for a revenge 30 years in the making. By the final minute, you will witness the exact moment my parents realized that while they spent a lifetime trying to erase me, I spent mine becoming the one person who could take everything they ever loved. I have built a career out of understanding the cold, hard weight of a signature. As a senior wealth management advisor in the heart of New York City, I spend my days navigating the intricate webs of trusts, estates, and the legacies people leave behind, yet my own history began with a legacy of total erasure. I am a woman who was forged in the silence of a boardroom-style betrayal, a past I have kept locked away until the day the paperwork finally came home. The year was 1994, but the memory is so vivid it feels like a wound that refuses to scar. I was 6 years old, sitting on a hard plastic chair in the corner of a state-run shelter that smelled of floor wax and stale air. I remember my shoes small, white patent leather flats that my mother had made me polish that morning. At the time, I thought we were going to a party. I didn't understand why we were sitting in a room where the paint was peeling off the walls in long gray strips. Across from me, my parents sat at a scarred oak table, looking like they had stepped out of the pages of a luxury catalog, utterly out of place in such a bleak environment. My father, Elias, kept checking his gold wristwatch, his foot tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the linoleum. He wasn't crying, he wasn't even looking at me. He was complaining about the parking meter outside, grumbling to my mother that he didn't want to get a ticket in this part of town. My mother, Margaret, was equally detached. She pulled a silver compact mirror from her designer handbag and spent the most pivotal moments of my life, checking the edges of her lipstick and smoothing her perfectly coiffed blonde hair. They weren't a couple in crisis, they were two people finishing a tedious chore. Between them and the veteran social worker, Mrs. Gable, lay a stack of documents that would change the course of my life. Mrs. Gable looked at them with a mixture of disbelief and a weary kind of disgust. She had seen poverty and she had seen desperation, but she had never seen this two healthy, wealthy parents voluntarily handing over their only child as if they were returning a defective piece of furniture. She paused, her hand resting on the final page, and looked my father directly in the eye. "Are you certain you understand the finality of what you are signing away, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice heavy with a chilling warning. "Once this is notarized, Laura is no longer your daughter. You are surrendering every right, every connection, and every future claim." My father didn't blink. He reached for the heavy fountain pen on the desk, his movements precise and practiced. "We understand exactly what we are gaining by doing this," he replied, his voice as flat as a sheet of ice. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the only sound in the room, a sharp, abrasive noise that felt like it was cutting into my very skin. In that moment, I felt a strange sensation, as if the air was being sucked out of the room. I was being legally deleted. I was a ghost while I was still breathing, watching my own parents turn me into a stranger for the sake of a gain I couldn't yet comprehend. After the ink dried, they stood up. Margaret gave me a small, tight smile, the kind you give a distant acquaintance at a grocery store, and they walked out the door without looking back. I scrambled to the window, my small hands pressing against the cold glass, watching them walk toward their luxury car. But as they pulled away, something else happened. A sleek, black sedan with windows so dark they looked like polished obsidian pulled into the spot they had just vacated. It was a vehicle that screamed of old money and quiet power, standing in stark contrast to the dilapidated building behind it. A man stepped out of the sedan, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than the shelter itself. He didn't look like a social worker or a policeman. He carried a leather briefcase with an air of absolute authority. He didn't look toward the playground or the other children. He walked straight into the manager's office. I didn't know then that he was a protector, a sentinel of a fortune that my parents had just unwittingly forfeited. That very night, while the other children slept on thin mats, I was whisked away in the back of a different car to a private facility that felt more like a boarding school than an orphanage. The black sedan hadn't come to take me home, but its presence meant that something massive had been triggered by my parents' cold-blooded signature. They thought they were erasing an unwanted burden that day. They didn't realize they had just started a countdown they could never stop. The transition from that cold, sterile shelter to my new reality was as swift as it was bewildering. While most children who are surrendered to the state fall into a chaotic abyss of lost files and crumbling foster homes, my path was carved with surgical precision. I quickly realized that I was never truly lost in the system because someone was holding the map. My records were never misplaced. My medical history was always up to date, and my living situations, though lacking in maternal warmth, were always safe, quiet, and exceptionally well-funded. I moved through my youth under the watch of an invisible hand, a ghostly benefactor who never sent a birthday card or a Christmas gift, but who provided me with elite tutors, private violin lessons, and the finest clothes. This support was entirely devoid of sentiment. It felt like an administrative obligation being executed with chilling efficiency. Every month, a courier would arrive not with a letter of encouragement, but with a progress report for me to sign, and a bank statement showing the tuition paid for the next semester of my private schooling. By the time I reached my teenage years, the nature of this arrangement became clear through a series of legal directives issued by the law firm representing my anonymous patron. The support came with a set of ironclad, non-negotiable conditions that would have broken a less determined child. I was required to maintain a perfect grade point average, and my summers were not spent at camp or at the beach, but in rigorous internships focusing on forensic accounting and estate law. Most importantly, the directive stated that any attempt to search for or contact Elias and Margaret Sterling would result in the immediate and permanent cessation of all funding. This enforced discipline created a monastic existence. I lived in a world of numbers, ledgers, and legal precedents, molding myself into a woman who learned to value data over the unpredictability of human emotion. I became a master of forensic accounting before I was 20, able to spot a hidden asset or a fraudulent transfer in a pile of thousands of documents. I was being sharpened like a blade, though I didn't yet know what I was meant to cut. This disciplined, high-pressure upbringing led me straight to the top of the financial world in Manhattan. Now, at 38, I am a senior advisor specializing in what we call ironclad trusts. My daily life involves constructing legal fortresses that protect vast fortunes from the very people who feel entitled to them. I work with clients who want to ensure their wealth doesn't fall into the hands of what I privately call unworthy heirs, the gamblers, the narcissists, and the betrayers. I am known for my professional lethalness, a reputation built on the fact that I can navigate the most complex guardianship structures without letting a shred of personal feeling cloud my judgment. My colleagues see a woman who is impeccably dressed, terrifyingly smart, and perhaps a bit cold, but they don't see the little girl who sat in a shelter watching her parents choose a parking meter over her life. They don't realize that my specialty isn't just a career choice. It is a subconscious preparation for a confrontation I have felt coming for 3 decades. In my corner office overlooking the city, I often find myself reflecting on the strange architecture of my life. I have spent years helping others secure their legacies while my own remained a mystery, locked behind the heavy oak doors of the law firms that raised me. I began to notice patterns in the trusts I managed that mirrored the bizarre conditions of my own upbringing. I saw how certain matriarchs and patriarchs used their wealth to bypass their disappointing children and secure their grandchildren's futures, but only if those grandchildren met specific, rigorous criteria. It was during a late-night audit of a defunct family estate that the first real crack appeared in the wall of my past. I noticed a recurring name in a series of archived shell companies, the same name that had appeared on the tuition checks of my youth. My intuition, sharpened by years of spotting financial anomalies, told me that my career in wealth management wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't just a survivor of a broken family who happened to do well for herself. Every tutor, every accounting exam, and every legal seminar had been a brick in a fortress built to protect me from the people who shared my blood. I realized then that my entire existence had been a long-term investment by a force I was only beginning to understand. I wasn't just a girl who was never lost. I was a girl who was being weaponized by the very system that took me in. The realization that I was a product of design rather than a victim of circumstance began to solidify as I delved deeper into a massive, dormant archive I had unearthed during a routine audit for a high-profile client. Among the sea of digital files and dusty ledgers was a sealed physical repository belonging to my late grandmother, Eleanor Sterling, a woman whose name was spoken in hushed tones of reverence and fear in the financial circles of the late 80s. My parents had told me she died penniless, a victim of her own eccentricities, but the documents I held in my shaking hands told a far more complex story. Within these files was the blueprint for something called the Bloodline Trust, a multi-generational financial fortress of staggering proportions. As I scanned the primary beneficiary list, my breath hitched in my throat. There, printed in crisp, timeless ink, was my own birth name. I wasn't just a minor mention or a distant recipient of a small stipend. I was listed as the primary qualified contingent beneficiary. However, it wasn't the amount of money that stopped my heart, but the specific, twisted activation clause that had been buried in the fine print of the trust's bylaws for over 30 years. As a wealth advisor, I had seen every trick in the book, but my grandmother was playing a game of chess from beyond the grave that was nothing short of brilliant. The trust contained what Eleanor had termed the toxicity clause, a legal mechanism designed to identify and prune the rot from the Sterling family tree. The document explicitly stated that if Elias and Margaret Sterling raised their daughter within their own household, they would serve as the trustees, enjoying a generous percentage of the interest to maintain a lifestyle befitting the Sterling name. But Eleanor had seen the narcissism in her own son and daughter-in-law long before I was even born. She had anticipated their greed and their lack of parental instinct. The clause mandated that if the parents ever voluntarily relinquished parental control or abandoned the child to the state, they would be legally deemed unfit stewards of the family legacy. At that precise moment of abandonment, their rights to the trust would be permanently terminated, and the entire corpus of the estate would skip them entirely. The wealth would then vest in me once I reached the age of 35, provided I had been raised entirely independent of their moral and financial influence. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a heavy shroud. For 30 years, I had viewed that day at the shelter as the moment my value was appraised at zero, but in reality, it was the day I became the most valuable asset in the Sterling portfolio. My parents, in their short-sighted hunt for immediate liquidity, had walked right into Eleanor's trap. They had likely been struggling with hidden debts or an insatiable thirst for a lifestyle they couldn't afford, and they thought that by getting rid of me, they could convince a court to release their inheritance early. They didn't realize that by signing those papers in that cold, peeling room, they were signing a confession of their own unworthiness. They had traded a lifetime of unimaginable wealth for whatever pittance of fast cash they thought they were gaining by reducing their overhead. Every struggle I faced, every night, I spent wondering why I wasn't enough, was actually the proof required by the trust to ensure I was being forged into someone who would never be like them. This new understanding finally shed a piercing light on the mystery of the black sedan that had haunted my childhood memories. For decades, I had thought that car belonged to a shadowy organization or a cold-hearted government agency, but now I saw the truth. The man in the charcoal suit was a trust protector, a legal sentinel hired by Eleanor's estate to ensure the integrity of the Bloodline Trust. He wasn't watching me out of a sense of pity or kindness. He was a silent auditor verifying that the terms of the toxicity clause were being met with absolute perfection. He was there at the shelter that day not to rescue me, but to document the moment of my parents' betrayal, officially certifying the trigger event that moved the wealth out of their reach forever. The private schools, the elite tutors, and the anonymous tuition payments weren't acts of charity. They were the trust's way of ensuring that the future owner of the sterling fortune was being educated with the precision and discipline the legacy demanded. The black sedan was the physical manifestation of a legal system that had been silently protecting my interests, while my own flesh and blood were trying to discard me like refuse. I sat in my office until the city lights below became a blurred sea of gold, staring at the original relinquishment papers my parents had signed in 1994. I could see the ink of my father's signature, so bold and confident, as if he believed he was finally free of a burden. I could almost hear my mother's shallow sighs as she smoothed her hair, oblivious to the fact that she was smoothing away her only ticket to the luxury she so desperately craved. They had spent 3 decades living in a house of cards, likely surviving on the remnants of what they managed to claw away before the trust's gates slammed shut, never realizing that the child they erased was the only person with the keys to the vault. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity wash over me, replacing the decades of lingering pain with a focused, professional resolve. I wasn't a victim seeking closure anymore. I was a creditor preparing to collect on a debt that had been accruing interest for 32 years. My parents didn't disqualify me from the family fortune that day at the shelter. They unknowingly certified me as the sole owner of everything they ever craved. The transition from discovery to execution was a matter of cold, calculated logistics, and as I watched the final signatures being stamped on the seizure orders, I felt the 32-year-old ghost of that 6-year-old girl finally stop trembling. My parents, Elias and Margaret, were now in their late 60s, inhabiting a world built entirely on a foundation of lies and unearned luxury. They lived in a sprawling colonial estate in a gated community in Connecticut, a place where they played the roles of retired aristocrats to perfection. They had spent decades meticulously erasing my existence from their history, weaving a tragic narrative for their social circle about an only daughter who had succumbed to a childhood illness. They were smug in their security, arrogant in their belief that they had successfully cheated both fate and the law, and entirely unprepared for the reality that the bill for their treachery was about to be presented in full. They spent their days at country clubs and charity galas, funded by what they believed was a bottomless inheritance, never realizing that every dollar they spent was being tracked by the very system they thought they had outsmarted. The evening of their reckoning was a rainy Tuesday, the kind of weather that mirrored the damp, gray morning they had left me at the shelter so long ago. Inside their warm, amber-lit living room, they were likely enjoying a quiet drink, surrounded by oil paintings and antique furniture that they treated as their birthright. Outside, the silence of their exclusive neighborhood was broken by the low hum of a powerful engine as a sleek, modern black sedan idled in their driveway. Its headlights cut through the torrential rain, casting long, menacing shadows against the white pillars of their home. For a few minutes, the car simply sat there, its presence a silent echo of the vehicle that had appeared at the shelter in 1994. Then, the doors opened, and a legal team from my firm, led by a senior partner who shared my penchant for ruthless precision, stepped out. They didn't arrive with the fanfare of sirens or the aggression of handcuffs. They arrived with something far more devastating: a mountain of forensic audits and a stack of court-certified repossession orders. When the maid opened the door, the team didn't wait for an invitation. They walked into the foyer with the practiced indifference of men who knew exactly who owned the floorboards beneath their feet. My father, Elias, emerged from the study, his face flushed with an indignant rage that quickly turned to a sickly shade of gray as he recognized the lead attorney. He tried to bluster, demanding to know the meaning of this intrusion into his private property, but the lead lawyer simply placed a heavy leather binder on the marble console table. They weren't there to discuss the past, and they certainly weren't there to talk about family or forgiveness. They were there to discuss the technicalities of occupancy agreements and the catastrophic failure of my parents to meet the good faith requirements of the Sterling Bloodline Trust. The legal team began to methodically explain that the inheritance my parents had been drawing from for 3 decades was never actually their property. It was revealed as a revocable loan, a temporary line of credit extended by the trust under the assumption that they were the rightful heirs of the Sterling legacy. As the lawyers began to read from the forensic audit, the true horror of my parents' situation began to sink in. because they had violated the fundamental clauses of Eleanor's estate, specifically by misrepresenting their status as fit parents and concealing the relinquishment of their child. Every cent they had spent since 1994 was now being reclassified as a debt. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the very clothes hanging in their closets had been purchased with funds that legally belonged to the beneficiary they had discarded. The trust was officially calling in the debt, effective immediately. The lawyers informed them that the estate they stood in was no longer their home. It had been purchased by a shell company owned by the trust years ago, and their right to occupy it had been terminated the moment the toxicity clause was fully verified. They were told, with a cold, professional detachment, that they had 24 hours to vacate the premises with only their personal effects, though even the definition of personal effects was now under legal review. I watched the feed from a hidden camera the security team had installed weeks prior, seeing my mother, Margaret, collapse into a silk-upholstered chair that she no longer owned. Her hand went to her throat, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her skin as she realized the sheer scale of the collapse. She looked around the room she had spent 30 years decorating, seeing it now for what it was. A temporary stage set for a play that had just been cancelled. Elias was speechless, his mouth working silently as he stared at the audit that detailed his life's work as a series of fraudulent withdrawals. They realized, with a soul-crushing horror, that they owned nothing. They had no savings, no equity, and no allies, as their entire social standing was tethered to a fortune that had just vanished into the hands of the ghosts they thought they had laid to rest. The arrogance that had defined their lives for 3 decades evaporated in an instant, leaving behind 2 terrified elderly people who had spent their lives building a monument to their own greed. The final blow came when the lead lawyer began to pack his briefcase, his eyes meeting my mother's tear-streaked face. In a voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and a sudden, sharp memory of her lost child, she asked a question that she hadn't dared to utter in 30 years. She asked where her daughter was, perhaps hoping that some lingering scrap of blood relation would offer them a reprieve from the cold steel of the law. The lawyer stopped, his hand on the door handle, and looked back at her with a gaze that held no pity, only the reflection of a long-delayed justice. He didn't give her a phone number or an address to a shelter, and he didn't tell her about the successful woman I had become. He simply leaned in and told her that the daughter she had signed away for the sake of her own comfort was the very person who had authorized this audit. When my mother asked where her daughter was, the lawyer didn't give her an address. He simply told her that the daughter was now her landlord. The morning air in Connecticut was crisp and indifferent as I stepped out of the black sedan and smoothed the front of my charcoal wool coat. Walking up the limestone steps of the estate, I felt a strange sense of architectural irony. The house was grand, intimidating, and meticulously designed to project a status that had been built on a foundation of stolen time. When I entered the morning room, the heavy oak doors groaning slightly on their hinges, I didn't see the giants who had once loomed over my childhood. I saw 2 elderly people huddled together on a silk-upholstered settee, their faces etched with the kind of frantic, desperate confusion that only comes to those who have lived a lifetime of unearned security. I sat across from them, placing my leather portfolio on the mahogany coffee table with a soft, final thud. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't offer the catharsis of an emotional outburst. Instead, I began what I privately called the audit of their souls. I opened the file and began to read. Reviewing 30 years, I cited the country club memberships paid for with trust interest, the luxury vacations funded by dividends meant for a child they had discarded, and the sheer, staggering volume of their greed. Every word I spoke was a cold brick in a wall I was building between them and the world they thought they owned. Elias tried to interrupt me twice, his voice cracking with a mixture of indignant rage and a sudden, sickening realization of his own impotence. He tried to play the family card, leaning forward with a trembling hand to speak of the sacred bond of blood and the unfortunate misunderstandings of the past. He tried to tell me that they had done what they did for my own good, that the world was a hard place and they had merely wanted me to be strong. I didn't let him finish the lie. I simply reached into my portfolio and produced a laminated copy of the original 1,994 relinquishment papers. I slid the document across the table, the fluorescent light of the room reflecting off the cold plastic. I pointed to their bold, confident signatures, the ink as dark as the day they had walked away from me. I reminded them, in a voice that was as sharp and sterile as a surgical blade, that they had legally and voluntarily declared me a stranger 32 years ago. They had appraised the value of their only child and decided it was worth less than a quiet life and a convenient parking spot. I told them that in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of the grandmother they had tried to swindle, they had effectively ceased to be my parents the moment that pen touched the paper. There was no bond of blood to appeal to because they had bled that bond dry for the sake of a paycheck and a social calendar. Watching the last flicker of hope die in Margaret's eyes was the first moment of true silence I had experienced in my entire life. She looked at the papers as if they were a death warrant, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the silk of the settee. However, I hadn't come there to be a monster or to cast them into the street. That would have been a mercy, a quick ending to a long overdue debt. I had come to be the curator of their consequences. I revealed my version of mercy, which was far more agonizing than any eviction could ever be. I informed them that I had officially converted the estate into a life estate. They would be allowed to remain in the house until their natural deaths, but they were no longer the masters of it. I told them that every painting on the walls, every antique in the halls, and even the silver they used for tea was now legally indexed as property of the trust. They could not sell a single asset to pay off their mounting debts. They could not host the grand charity galas that gave them their sense of identity, and they could not make a single repair or alteration to the property without my personal, written authorization. They were now merely residents in a museum of their own failures, living under the constant, invisible supervision of the daughter they had tried to delete. The most calculated part of the arrangement was the financial tether. I informed them that their days of unlimited credit and black card spending were over. I had established a survival-level stipend that would be deposited into a controlled account on the first of every month, an amount I would approve personally. It was enough to cover their groceries, their basic utilities, and their medical expenses, but not a single penny more. I told them they would have to learn the meaning of a budget, the very thing they had ignored, while spending Eleanor's fortune. They would live in luxury, surrounded by opulence they could no longer touch or control, like ghosts trapped in a house that had already moved on without them. They would be safe and they would be fed, but they would be utterly powerless, stripped of the ability to manipulate anyone or anything ever again. I saw Elias look at the room around him, realizing for the first time that the walls were a cage, and the furniture was a reminder of everything he had lost through his own short-sightedness. The final stroke of the pen, the one that truly severed their connection to the world they craved, was what I called the social erasure. I informed them that as the sole trustee and the only qualified beneficiary of the Sterling Bloodline Trust, I was stripping the family name from the legacy entirely. The Sterling name would no longer be associated with the charitable foundations or the scholarship funds Eleanor had established. I told them that I was redirecting 80% of the trust's corpus to the state-run shelter where they had left me in 1994. I was funding a new, state-of-the-art wing for abandoned children, and it would be named after the social worker who had tried to warn them that day. The Sterling name was being retired, relegated to the fine print of a closed audit. I looked at my mother, who was staring at her reflection in a silver tea tray, and I told her quite clearly that I wasn't punishing her for her cruelty. I was simply correcting the paperwork to reflect the truth. They had spent 3 decades choosing a life without me, and now, through the meticulous application of the law, they finally had that life in its purest, most absolute form. I stood up and closed my portfolio, not needing an apology or a moment of reconciliation, because those things require a soul that they had long ago traded for a lifestyle. I walked out of the house and down the limestone steps, leaving them to sit in the amber light of a room that no longer recognized them. I left them with their lives and their home, but I took away the only thing they ever truly loved, their power to matter. In the months that followed my departure from that house in Connecticut, the silence I left behind became my parents' permanent companion. I watched from a distance as the world they had spent 30 years buying began to shrink until it was no larger than the 4 walls of their estate. The high society they had once reigned over, those friends who valued lineage and liquidity above all else, proved to be as fickle as the fortune Elias and Margaret had tried to steal. Once the invitations stopped and the charity galas were no longer hosted in their ballroom, they became pariahs in their own community. People didn't shun them because of their cruelty to me, they shunned them because they were no longer useful. They were left to wander through rooms filled with art they couldn't sell and memories they couldn't bear, living on the survival stipend I deposited like clockwork. They were safe, their medical needs were met, and they were never hungry, yet they were utterly miserable because they were irrelevant. I realized that true karma isn't a dramatic end or a sudden tragedy. It is the long, slow realization that you have become a ghost in your own life, forgotten by the very world you sacrificed your soul to impress. My parents had spent my childhood trying to erase me, but in the end, they were the ones who vanished into the gray fog of their own insignificance. With the sterling fortune finally under my control and the past no longer a weight around my neck, I found a new sense of purpose that far exceeded the thrill of high-stakes wealth management. I used my expertise to establish the Protectorate Foundation, a specialized legal shield designed for children trapped in the foster care system who are being manipulated or discarded because of their potential inheritances. I realized that there were thousands of other Lauras out there, children whose futures were being traded for a paycheck by the very adults meant to protect them. I turned my trauma into a weapon, creating a network of forensic accountants and estate attorneys who work pro bono to ensure that no other child is ever erased from their own history for the sake of an insurance payout or a trust fund. Through this work, I found a different kind of family, one built not on blood or legal signatures, but on the shared experience of survival and the fierce protection of the vulnerable. The gratitude of a child who finally feels seen and secure became the interest on an investment I never knew I was making, providing me with a warmth that my biological parents were never capable of giving. Standing now at the floor-to-ceiling window of my New York office, I watched as a familiar black sedan pulled away from the curb 40 stories below. For years, the sight of that car had triggered a cold spike of fear in my chest, a reminder of the day my life was signed away in a sterile shelter. But as I watched it merge into the chaotic, vibrant pulse of Manhattan traffic, I felt nothing but a profound sense of peace. I realized that I am no longer defined by the day I was abandoned, nor am I defined by the mysterious benefactor who shaped my upbringing with such calculated discipline. I am the woman who took those broken pieces and built a fortress of her own. I have reclaimed my name, not as a sterling, but as the architect of my own destiny. The paperwork that once served as my death warrant has been rewritten into a manifesto for a better future. I looked out over the skyline, the sun catching the glass of the buildings like 1,000 mirrors of light, and I breathed in the quiet, steady air of a life that is entirely mine. The debt has been collected, the audit is closed, and the legacy I am building now is one that will never be used to hurt another living soul. They erased me once to save themselves. The difference is this time, I'm the one holding the pen, and I've decided their story is over. I truly hope this story resonated with you and served as a reminder that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it. If you found satisfaction in seeing justice served and a life reclaimed from the shadows of betrayal, please consider subscribing to our channel and joining our community. We strive to bring you powerful, emotionally rich narratives that prove the human spirit is far more resilient than the greed that tries to break it. We would also love to hear your thoughts on Laura's journey in the comments section below. Do you believe her version of mercy, the gilded cage, was a fitting punishment for parents who chose a parking spot over their child, or would you have handled the situation differently? Your insights and stories of overcoming life's obstacles mean a lot to us and help others who might be navigating their own difficult paths. Thank you for spending your time with us today and for being part of this conversation. They erased me once to save themselves. The difference is this time, I'm the one holding the pen, and I've decided their story is over.